On a cold February morning in 1998, in the flat expanse of rural Kansas, where the wind carries secrets across endless fields, a young woman named Jennifer Hayes stepped out of her farmhouse to begin what should have been an ordinary day. By nightfall, her family would report her missing. By week's end, investigators would find themselves facing a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit together. And for nearly 7 years, the truth would remain buried beneath layers of silence, misdirection, and the kind of deception that only someone intimately close could maintain. The arrest, when it finally came in 2005, WOULD Chinese letter SHOC, a community that thought it knew everyone within its borders. But how well can we ever truly know another person, even those who share our homes, our meals, our beds? How many secrets can accumulate in the space between what we show the world and what we hide in darkness? The town of Clearwater, Kansas, population barely 3,000 souls, sits in the southeastern corner of Sedgwick County like a period at the end of a sentence nobody bothered to finish. In February 1998, Main Street consisted of 2 blocks of weathered storefronts, a grain elevator that dominated the skyline, a single stoplight that blinked yellow after 9 in the evening, and a diner where everyone knew your name before you walked through the door. The Hayes family farm sprawled across 200 acres of wheat fields about 4 miles east of town, connected to civilization by a gravel road that turned to mud whenever it rained and dust whenever it didn't. The farmhouse itself, a white 2-story structure with green shutters and a wraparound porch, had belonged to Jennifer's grandfather before her. It was the kind of place where 3 generations had been born, lived, and died within the same 4 walls, where the floorboards creaked in familiar patterns, and every room held the accumulated weight of family history. Jennifer Marie Hayes was 28 years old that winter, a slender woman with auburn hair she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of quiet competence that comes from growing up understanding that work doesn't wait for convenient moments. She had married Daniel Hayes 5 years earlier, in a ceremony at the First Baptist Church that the whole town attended. Daniel, 32, worked as a mechanic at Patterson's Auto Repair in town, his hands perpetually stained with grease no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. They had 2 children, Emma, age 4, and Jacob, barely 18 months old. Those who knew Jennifer described her as devoted to those children in the way that mothers in farming communities often are, understanding that vigilance and love are sometimes indistinguishable. She homeschooled Emma, maintained a large vegetable garden even in winter's dormancy, and kept the farmhouse with a tidiness that suggested someone who found comfort in order and routine. The morning of February 14th began unremarkably. The temperature hovered around 32 degrees, the sky that particular shade of gray that promises snow but never quite delivers. Jennifer rose at 6, as she did every morning, and made coffee in the old percolator that had been her grandmother's. Daniel left for work at 7:15, his blue pickup truck crunching down the gravel driveway as the sun attempted to break through clouds on the eastern horizon. Emma played with her dolls in the living room while Jacob napped in his crib upstairs. The house smelled of toast and coffee, and the faint lavender scent of the sachets Jennifer tucked into every closet and drawer. At approximately 9:30 that morning, Jennifer's mother, Susan Winters, who lived in town, called the farmhouse. The phone rang 6 times before the answering machine picked up. Susan left a brief message asking Jennifer to return the call. At 11:45, she called again. This time, the answering machine did not activate. The phone simply rang and rang, the sound echoing through rooms that may or may not have been empty. Susan, whose maternal instinct had been honed by 3 decades of motherhood, felt the first flutter of unease, At 1:30 in the afternoon, she called Daniel at the repair shop. He sounded unconcerned. Jennifer probably took the kids for a walk, he suggested. Maybe she drove into town for groceries. Give her time. But Susan could not shake the feeling that something had shifted in the universe, that some fundamental wrongness had entered the world. At 3 o'clock, she drove out to the farmhouse herself, her hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. The gravel drive seemed longer than usual, the bare trees along the fence line more skeletal, the silence more profound. When she arrived, she found Jennifer's car, a 1994 Honda Accord, parked in its usual spot beside the barn. The house appeared undisturbed from the outside. Susan knocked on the front door, called out, waited. Nothing. She tried the handle, unlocked. The door swung open on hinges that needed oil. Inside, the house maintained its usual orderliness. Emma's dolls sat arranged on the living room floor in what appeared to be a tea party formation. Jacob's playpen stood in the corner, empty but recently used, a blanket still warm from the heating vent. In the kitchen, Jennifer's coffee cup sat on the counter, half full and long since cold. The morning newspaper lay folded on the table, the crossword puzzle partially completed in Jennifer's neat handwriting. Everything suggested a woman who had stepped away momentarily and intended to return. Everything except Jennifer herself, who was nowhere to be found. And the children, Emma and Jacob, were also gone. Susan called Daniel again from the farmhouse phone, her voice higher now, edged with panic. He arrived within 20 minutes, driving faster than he should have on those gravel roads. Together they searched the house room by room, calling Jennifer's name, opening closets, checking behind doors. In the master bedroom, the bed was made with military precision, pillows arranged just so. In Emma's room, toys sat in their designated bins. Jacob's crib held a mobile that turned slowly in the draft from the heating vent. Susan checked the diaper bag hanging on the back of the nursery door, still there. Jennifer never went anywhere with the children without that bag. Daniel called the Sedgwick County Sheriff's Department at 4:17 that afternoon. Deputy Marcus Thornton took the call, making notes on a pad that would later become part of the official case file. A woman missing with 2 small children, vehicle still at residence. No signs of struggle. Last confirmed sighting approximately 9 hours prior. Deputy Thornton arrived at the Hayes farmhouse at 4:45 as the winter sun began its descent toward the flat horizon. He walked through the house with Daniel and Susan, his trained eyes cataloging details. No forced entry, no overturned furniture, no blood, no indication of violence. The kitchen sink held a single coffee cup and a small plate, both rinsed but not yet washed. The back door was locked from the inside. All the windows were latched. Those who have ever walked through a home where someone has vanished understand the particular quality of silence that settles into such spaces. It is not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something that presses against the walls and pulls in corners. Deputy Thornton felt it as he moved through the Hayes farmhouse, though his report would describe only facts, times, observations. He noted the lack of Jennifer's purse, which Susan identified as missing from its usual hook by the front door. Also missing, Jennifer's winter coat, the children's coats, and apparently a few changes of clothing for the children, though this was harder to confirm given the volume of small garments in various stages of cleanliness. What remained? All of Jennifer's identification, her checkbook, the diaper bag, and most tellingly, her car keys, which Deputy Thornton found in a ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter. By 6 o'clock that evening, as darkness settled over Clearwater like a physical weight, the Sedgwick County Sheriff's Department had initiated a missing persons investigation. Sheriff Raymond Kowalski, a 30-year veteran who had seen his share of domestic situations in this rural county, arrived at the farmhouse to assess the situation personally. He spoke with Daniel Hayes on the front porch while crime scene technicians photographed the interior. Daniel appeared appropriately concerned, Sheriff Kowalski would later note, though perhaps not as distraught as one might expect. He kept his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight, his answers brief and direct. Yes, things had been fine between them. No, Jennifer had no reason to leave. No, she had never threatened to take the children and go. No history of depression. No family conflicts. No financial troubles. Everything was fine. Everything had been fine. Clear's throat. The search operation began in earnest the following morning, February 15th, as a pale sun rose over farmland still crunchy with frost. The Sedgwick County Sheriff's Department mobilized every available deputy. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation sent 2 agents. Volunteers from Clearwater and surrounding communities arrived in pickup trucks and SUVs, wearing heavy coats and carrying thermoses of coffee, ready to walk grid patterns across frozen fields. By 8 o'clock, more than 100 people had assembled at the Hayes farmhouse, transforming the quiet property into a command center of organized chaos. Search teams spread out in all directions, walking shoulder to shoulder through wheat stubble and pasture land, calling Jennifer's name into the wind. Trained K-9 units from Wichita arrived by mid-morning, bloodhounds straining at their leashes as handlers let them scent items from Jennifer's dresser drawer. The dogs circled the farmhouse, noses to the ground, then headed east toward the property line before losing the trail at the gravel road. Helicopters from the Kansas Highway Patrol flew grids over the surrounding countryside, pilots scanning for any anomaly in the landscape. Divers checked stock ponds on neighboring properties, though the water was too cold for any reasonable person to have entered voluntarily. Every barn, every outbuilding, every abandoned structure within a 10-mile radius received attention from search teams who understood that the first 48 hours were critical. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. The diner on Main Street became an unofficial headquarters where volunteers received assignments and warm meals. The First Baptist Church organized a phone tree to coordinate shifts. Local businesses donated food, water, and equipment. Jennifer's photograph, a recent family portrait taken at the Sears in Wichita, appeared on flyers that volunteers distributed throughout southeastern Kansas. In the photograph, Jennifer smiled slightly, her eyes on her children rather than the camera, one hand resting on Emma's shoulder while she held Jacob against her hip. The caption read, Jennifer Marie Hayes, 28 years old, 54, 120 pounds, auburn hair, green eyes. Last seen February 14, 1998. Also missing, Emma Hayes, 4 years old, Jacob Hayes, 18 months old. Television stations from Wichita sent news crews. By the evening of February 15th, Jennifer's disappearance had become the lead story on local broadcasts. The footage showed search teams walking through fields, interviewed volunteers speaking hopefully about bringing Jennifer home, and Daniel Hayes standing in front of the farmhouse, his face carefully composed as he made a brief statement. Jennifer, if you can hear this, please come home. We love you. Whatever is wrong, we can work it through. Just come home safe with the kids. His voice remained steady throughout. He did not cry. Those who watched the broadcast noted this. Some found his composure admirable under stress. Others found it unsettling. Behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to assemble a timeline that contained troubling inconsistencies. Daniel Hayes stated that he had left for work at 7:15 that morning, arriving at Patterson's Auto Repair by 7:30. The shop's owner, Jim Patterson, confirmed that Daniel's truck was in the parking lot when Jim arrived to open at 7:45. However, Daniel's first work order of the day was not time-stamped until 9:23. Where had Daniel been for nearly an hour and a half? When questioned, Daniel explained that he had spent the time organizing his tools, cleaning his work area, and drinking coffee in the break room. A reasonable enough explanation, though it lacked witnesses. Jim Patterson had been in the office. The other mechanic, Kyle Morrison, had not arrived until after 9. Investigators also examined the phone records. Susan Winters's calls to the farmhouse at 9:30 and 11:45 were documented by the phone company. But there was another call, made from the Hayes farmhouse to Patterson's auto repair at 8:37 that morning. The call lasted 43 seconds. Daniel, when asked about this call, stated that Jennifer must have called him, though he did not specifically remember the conversation. What had they discussed? He couldn't recall. Something about groceries, maybe, or bill payments, just routine matters. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the vagueness of these responses. The physical evidence recovered from the farmhouse painted a picture of normalcy disrupted mid-routine. Forensic technicians found no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds documented anywhere, no indication that violence had occurred within those walls. The coffee cup in the kitchen, dusted for fingerprints, bore only Jennifer's prints. The living room showed no disturbance. The children's rooms were tidy. In the master bedroom, investigators noted that the bed was made, but a closer examination revealed something curious. The quilt that typically covered the bed, a handmade item that Susan Winters identified as one she had given Jennifer as a wedding gift, was missing. Also absent, one set of sheets, identified by Susan as the blue flannel sheets Jennifer preferred during winter. Cadaver dogs were brought to the property on February 17th, 3 days after Jennifer's disappearance. The dogs alerted in the barn, an old structure with a dirt floor and the smell of decades of animal occupancy. But when investigators excavated the area where the dogs had indicated interest, they found nothing. Old animal remains, perhaps, or the residual scent from butchering activities that had occurred there in previous years. The dogs also showed interest in the area behind the farmhouse where the family's trash barrels stood, but again, excavation revealed nothing conclusive. False positives happen, handlers acknowledged, especially in agricultural settings where the scent of decay from various sources can linger. Those who knew him said that Daniel Hayes maintained a consistent demeanor throughout the investigation. He participated in searches when his work schedule allowed. He spoke with investigators whenever requested. He provided consent for searches of the farmhouse, the barn, the vehicles, though technically such consent was unnecessary given that Jennifer was a missing person rather than a confirmed victim of foul play. He stayed at the farmhouse, sleeping in the master bedroom despite offers from relatives to stay with them. He kept the house tidy, maintaining Jennifer's standards. He cried occasionally, brief episodes that seemed to overtake him suddenly, but he always composed himself quickly. Some found this strength admirable, others found it mechanical. The investigation expanded to Jennifer's personal life, searching for any reason she might have left voluntarily. Investigators interviewed friends, family members, and acquaintances. They examined her medical records, looking for any history of mental health issues. They reviewed her financial records, searching for secret bank accounts or large cash withdrawals. They checked bus stations, train stations, and airports throughout Kansas and neighboring states, showing Jennifer's photograph to ticket agents and security personnel. They interviewed her physician, her pastor, her former coworkers from before she became a stay-at-home mother. Everyone described Jennifer the same way: devoted mother, loving wife, content with her life on the farm, no indication she was unhappy or planning to leave. Clear's throat. By the end of February, the intensive search operations had scaled back. Hundreds of square miles had been covered. Thousands of tips had been investigated. Numerous false sightings had been reported and debunked. A woman matching Jennifer's description in Oklahoma City turned out to be a local resident. A report of children matching Emma and Jacob's descriptions at a rest stop in Missouri led nowhere. The FBI had become involved, entering Jennifer and the children into the National Crime Information Center database, but even their considerable resources produced no breakthrough. The case file grew thick with reports, interviews, and dead ends. Sheriff Kowalski held a press conference on March 2nd, 18 days after the disappearance, acknowledging that the investigation had reached an impasse. They would continue following leads, he assured the public, but without new information, there was little more to do but wait. Daniel Hayes returned to his job at Patterson's Auto Repair. Life, as it does even in the midst of tragedy, continued its forward motion. The volunteers who had searched fields returned to their own homes and families. The news crews moved on to other stories. The flyers with Jennifer's photograph faded in store windows and on telephone poles. And in the farmhouse 4 miles east of Clearwater, Daniel Hayes lived alone in rooms that echoed with absence. The months passed with the slow inevitability of seasons changing. Spring came to the Kansas plains, turning the wheat fields green. Summer brought heat that shimmered over the flat landscape, making the horizon waver like something uncertain. Autumn painted the trees in brief color before stripping them bare again. And always, the investigation remained open but essentially dormant, a file on Sheriff Kowalski's desk that grew dusty with time. Susan Winters, Jennifer's mother, could not accept the silence. She drove out to the farmhouse weekly, bringing casseroles and questions that Daniel answered with increasing impatience. Where could Jennifer be? Where were the children? Had he heard anything? Remembered anything? Daniel's responses became more clipped, his tolerance for her visits shorter. Eventually, he asked her to call before coming out. Then he asked her to stop coming at all. She was making things harder, he said. He needed to move forward. She needed to let him grieve in his own way. In December of 1998, Daniel Hayes packed up Jennifer's belongings. Her clothes went into boxes destined for goodwill. Her jewelry, what little she had, went to Susan Winters. The children's rooms, Emma's and Jacob's, he left mostly untouched, though he closed their doors and kept them that way. When Susan learned about the donated clothing, she expressed dismay. Daniel explained that he couldn't bear looking at Jennifer's things anymore, that they were a constant reminder of his loss. Susan understood, or tried to, though something about the efficiency with which he had cleared out his wife's presence troubled her in ways she could not articulate. The year 1999 brought no new developments. The investigation remained technically active, but in practical terms, the trail had gone completely cold. Sheriff Kowalski retired in April of that year, turning over his cases to his successor, Sheriff Thomas Brennan, a younger man with fresh ideas but no new leads in the Hayes case. The first anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance passed with a small prayer service at the First Baptist Church. Daniel attended, sitting in a back pew, leaving immediately after the benediction. In June of 1999, 16 months after Jennifer's disappearance, Daniel Hayes began dating again. The woman was Corinne Mitchell, a waitress at the diner in town, divorced with no children, pleasant and uncomplicated. Those who saw them together noted that Daniel seemed lighter, less burdened. Some members of the community thought it was too soon. Others argued that a man had needs, that life continued, that Daniel deserved happiness. Corinne moved into the farmhouse that October, bringing with her a small collection of belongings and a willingness to live in a space haunted by the memory of her predecessor. Susan Winters learned of the new relationship from a friend who had seen Daniel and Corinne having dinner at a restaurant in Wichita. The news struck her like a physical blow. She called the farmhouse and spoke with Daniel, her voice shaking with emotion. How could he move on so quickly? What about Jennifer? What about Emma and Jacob? Daniel's response was cold, final. Jennifer was gone. The children were gone. He had waited, he had mourned, and now he needed to live his life. Susan should do the same. But Susan Winters could not let go. She continued to call the sheriff's department regularly, asking about new leads, new searches, new anything. She hired a private investigator in early 2000, a retired police detective from Wichita who reviewed the case file and conducted his own interviews. His conclusion, delivered in a formal report that cost Susan $3,000, was that Jennifer Hayes had most likely left voluntarily with the children, probably with assistance from someone the investigation had not identified. He found no evidence of foul play. Susan read the report once, then filed it away, unsatisfied. The years accumulated. Daniel and Corinne married in a small ceremony at the courthouse in May of 2001. They settled into a quiet life on the farm, Daniel continuing his work at the repair shop, Corinne taking a job at a medical office in town. They attended church sporadically, socialized little, and seemed content in their isolation. The farmhouse, which had once been filled with the sounds of children and the routines of family life, became a place of adult quiet, punctuated only by the hum of appliances and the creak of settling wood. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the whisper of suspicion but suppressed it beneath layers of loyalty and hope, understand that truth sometimes emerges not in dramatic revelations but in tiny fractures that spread slowly over time. Corinne Mitchell Hayes began noticing things in the second year of her marriage. Small things, insignificant things, Daniel's reluctance to discuss Jennifer, his anger when anyone mentioned the case, the way he flinched when a television news program covered a missing persons case, his insistence on keeping the children's rooms locked, claiming he would deal with them eventually, but never doing so. In the summer of 2003, 5 years after Jennifer's disappearance, Corinne asked if they could redecorate the farmhouse, perhaps make it feel more like their home rather than a memorial to his previous life. Daniel agreed with one condition: the children's rooms remained off-limits. When Corinne pressed for an explanation, he became angry in a way she had never seen before, his face flushing, his voice rising. She dropped the subject but could not drop the unease that had taken root in her chest. The nightmare started around this time, Corinne would later tell investigators. Daniel would wake thrashing, sometimes shouting things she could not quite make out. When she asked what he was dreaming about, he claimed not to remember. But she heard him in those moments between sleep and waking saying words that chilled her. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. They're safe now." When she asked directly what these phrases meant, he insisted they were just dreams, meaningless fragments of a stressed subconscious. The marriage deteriorated slowly, then quickly, the way neglected structures eventually collapse. Daniel became withdrawn, working longer hours at the shop, coming home late, speaking in monosyllables. Corinne, for her part, found herself watching her husband with new eyes, seeing patterns she had missed before. The way he tensed whenever a sheriff's vehicle drove past the farm. The way he monitored the news obsessively, particularly any stories about missing persons cases being solved, bodies being discovered. The way he never, ever spoke Jennifer's name unless forced to do so. In October of 2004, Corinne Mitchell Hayes made a decision. She called the Sedgwick County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with someone about the Jennifer Hayes case. She was transferred to Detective Sarah Mullins, a newer member of the department who had been reviewing cold cases, looking for angles previous investigators might have missed. Corinne's call would mark the beginning of the end of the silence. Detective Mullins met with Corinne at a coffee shop in Wichita, away from Clearwater, and the possibility of being seen by anyone who might report back to Daniel. Karen spoke for nearly 2 hours, describing the nightmares, the locked rooms, the sudden anger, the general sense that something was deeply wrong in the farmhouse. She had no proof, she acknowledged. Nothing concrete. Just a feeling, a certainty that had grown over 3 years of marriage until it was undeniable. Detective Mullins listened, taking notes, asking careful questions. At the end of the conversation, she asked Karen if she would be willing to continue living in the farmhouse, to observe, to report anything unusual, to essentially become an informant in her own marriage. Karen agreed. The investigation quietly reopened. Detective Mullins began by reviewing the original case file, which had grown dusty in storage. She noted the inconsistencies previous investigators had documented but never fully pursued. The gap in Daniel's timeline on the morning of the disappearance. The missing bedding. The 43-second phone call from the farmhouse to the repair shop. The cadaver dogs alerting in the barn. Individually, these details meant little. Together, they formed a pattern that suggested something darker than an inexplicable vanishing. Detective Mullins obtained warrants to review more recent records. Daniel Hayes's phone records from 1998 showed calls to his cell phone from the farmhouse at 8:37, just over an hour after he claimed to have left for work. Cell tower records indicated his phone was near the farmhouse at the time, not at the repair shop in town. Financial records showed that in March of 1998, a month after Jennifer's disappearance, Daniel had paid nearly $800 to have new concrete poured in the barn, replacing a section of the existing floor. When questioned about this by investigators at the time, he had explained that the old concrete was cracked and he was making improvements to the property. Nothing suspicious about that. Except that Detective Mullins, reviewing photographs of the barn taken during the initial investigation, could see no obvious damage to the floor in question. In February of 2005, Detective Mullins requested permission from the current sheriff to conduct another search of the Hayes property, this time with ground-penetrating radar equipment. The request was approved. On March 3rd, 7 years and 17 days after Jennifer Hayes vanished, a team of forensic specialists arrived at the farmhouse with equipment that could see beneath the surface of the earth. Karen had made sure Daniel would be at work. She met the team at the property and showed them to the barn. The ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomaly beneath the new concrete section of the barn floor. Something was there, something that did not match the surrounding soil composition. Detective Mullins obtained a warrant to excavate. On March 7, 2005, with Daniel Hayes still unaware that his property was being searched again, forensic technicians broke through the concrete and began digging. At a depth of approximately 4 feet, they found the blue flannel sheets Susan Winters had identified as missing from Jennifer's bedroom. Wrapped in those sheets were the remains of 3 individuals, an adult female, a small child, and an infant. The bodies had been interred for 7 years, but forensic anthropologists would later confirm through dental records and DNA testing that they were Jennifer Marie Hayes, Emma Hayes, and Jacob Hayes. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment, based on the condition of the remains and the position of the bodies, suggested that the victims had been placed in the makeshift grave within hours of death, not days or weeks. Daniel Hayes was arrested at Patterson's Auto Repair on March 8, 2005, at approximately 3 in the afternoon. Deputy Marcus Thornton, who had been one of the first responders to the original missing persons call 7 years earlier, made the arrest. Daniel did not resist. He did not ask why he was being arrested. He simply stood, held out his wrists for the handcuffs, and followed Deputy Thornton to the waiting patrol car. Jim Patterson, watching from the office window, would later say that Daniel's expression showed no surprise, only a kind of resigned acceptance, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. The arrest made national news. Camera crews returned to Clearwater, transforming the tiny town once again into the center of media attention. The farmhouse became a crime scene, yellow tape cordoning off the property while forensic teams meticulously documented everything. Corinne Mitchell Hayes, who had facilitated the search that led to the discovery, left the farmhouse and returned to her apartment in town, her brief marriage effectively over. Susan Winters, upon learning that her daughter and grandchildren had been found, collapsed and had to be hospitalized for observation. The grief was expected. What surprised everyone was the relief mixed with that grief, the terrible comfort of finally knowing. Daniel Hayes was charged with 3 counts of first-degree homicide. He initially maintained his innocence, claiming through his court-appointed attorney that the bodies must have been placed there by someone else, though he offered no explanation for who might have done such a thing or how they could have poured new concrete in his barn without his knowledge. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen, methodically assembled their case, the timeline placing Daniel near the farmhouse when he claimed to be at work. The phone call from Jennifer that morning, which cell phone records suggested Daniel did not take at the repair shop, but rather somewhere near the farmhouse. The missing bedding, the hasty concrete work, the cadaver dogs that had alerted in the barn 7 years earlier, Corinne's testimony about the nightmares and the strange behavior, the locked rooms that Daniel had refused to address for years. In November of 2005, 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, Daniel Hayes accepted a plea agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty to 3 counts of second-degree manslaughter and providing a full confession about what had happened that Valentine's Day morning in 1998, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty. Daniel's attorney advised acceptance. The evidence was overwhelming. A jury would likely convict on first-degree charges, and Kansas had recently resumed executions after a long hiatus. The plea was Daniel's best option for avoiding death row. The confession, delivered in a windowless room at the Sedgwick County Jail with his attorney present, was recorded and would later be introduced at the sentencing hearing. Daniel Hayes, speaking in a monotone that suggested emotional exhaustion, described the events of February 14, 1998. He had woken that morning, he said, to the sounds of Jennifer preparing breakfast. They had argued, though he could not clearly remember what the argument was about. Something trivial. Household finances, maybe, or his hours at work. Small things that had accumulated into larger resentments. The argument had escalated. Jennifer had threatened to leave to take the children back to her mother's house, at least for a while. Something in him had snapped. He described it as though it had happened to someone else, as though he had watched from outside himself. He pushed her. She fell, striking her head on the corner of the kitchen counter. The sound, he said, was terrible. She did not get up. The children, Emma and Jacob, had been in the living room. Emma came running when she heard the noise. Daniel said he panicked. He could not let Emma tell anyone what she had seen. He could not let anyone know what had happened. The next part of his confession was delivered in fragments, his voice breaking, his hands covering his face. He made sure Emma would not talk. Then Jacob, who had started crying in his playpen. 3 lives ended in the space of minutes, in a farmhouse kitchen on a cold February morning, because of an argument Daniel Hayes could barely remember, and a panic that had overwhelmed any sense of reason or humanity. He wrapped their bodies in the sheets from the master bedroom. He carried them to the barn, using a wheelbarrow because he could not manage the weight otherwise. He dug the grave using a spade, the frozen ground resisting every thrust of the blade. It took hours. He buried them together, Jennifer with a child in each arm, the way she might have held them for comfort. Then he covered the grave with loose dirt, and knowing it would not be enough, called a concrete company that afternoon, claiming he needed emergency repairs to the barn floor before the weekend. The workers came the next day, poured the new section, and never questioned why this particular area needed replacement. After disposing of the bodies, Daniel returned to the house. He cleaned the kitchen. He staged the scene to suggest Jennifer had simply left, taking some clothing but leaving most things behind, creating the impression of a sudden but voluntary departure. He called Jennifer's phone from the farmhouse, letting it ring, establishing a pattern that would later fit his narrative of confusion and concern. Then he went to work, arriving late but within a window that seemed reasonable for a man who had spent the morning distracted by household matters. When Susan Winters called him that afternoon, worried because she could not reach Jennifer, Daniel had expressed appropriate concern and rushed home, performing worry for the cameras and the investigators who would soon arrive. He had lived with it for 7 years. The knowledge, the guilt, the fear of discovery. He had buried his wife and children beneath concrete and continued his life as though nothing had happened, attending searches for people he knew would never be found alive, accepting condolences for a loss he had caused. He had dated, remarried, and tried to build something new on a foundation of lies that ultimately could not support the weight. The courtroom on December 12, 2005, was filled beyond capacity. Susan Winters sat in the front row, flanked by family members who held her upright through sheer will. Karen Mitchell Hayes sat several rows back, her presence a reminder that she too had been a victim of Daniel's deception, though in a different way. The families of Jennifer's friends filled the gallery. Members of the media occupied every available seat, notebooks ready, cameras filming for the evening news. Judge Patricia Delgado, a woman known for her measured approach to even the most emotional cases, presided over the sentencing hearing. Daniel Hayes, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and shackles, sat at the defense table, his face expressionless as victim impact statements were read. Susan Winters spoke, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her face. She described Jennifer as a child, as a teenager, as a young mother. She described Emma's laugh and Jacob's smile. She described the 7 years of not knowing, of hopping against hope, of clinging to possibilities that grew more unlikely with each passing day. And she described the moment she learned the truth. The relief and agony intertwined so tightly they became indistinguishable. Judge Delgado sentenced Daniel Hayes to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He would spend the remainder of his natural life in the El Dorado Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in Butler County, Kansas. As the sentence was pronounced, Daniel showed no reaction. He simply nodded, as though confirming something he had known all along. As deputies led him from the courtroom, he did not look back at the gallery, did not meet Susan Winters' eyes, did not offer any final words. He simply shuffled out, the chains at his ankles marking each step with a metallic rhythm that echoed in the stunned silence. Clear's throat. The farmhouse where Jennifer, Emma, and Jacob Hayes spent their final morning was sold at auction in 2006. The proceeds went to Susan Winters, who used the money to establish a small memorial scholarship in her daughter's name at the local community college, helping young mothers pursue education. The new owners demolished the barn where the bodies had been buried and built a workshop in its place, as though fresh construction could erase the history beneath. The house itself still stands, though most people in Clearwater avoid driving past it, as though tragedy might be contagious. Susan Winters never remarried, never moved away from the area, never stopped visiting the graves of her daughter and grandchildren at the Clearwater Cemetery, where they were finally laid to rest together in March of 2006. The headstone reads simply, Jennifer Marie Hayes, beloved daughter and mother, 1969-1998, with her children Emma and Jacob, now at peace. On Valentine's Day each year, Susan places fresh flowers there, refusing to let the date that claimed their lives be the only thing that defines their memory. This case, like all cases where family members destroy their own, leaves questions that no confession can fully answer. What transforms ordinary anger into lethal violence? How does someone commit such acts and then live normally among us? What signs did we miss? The people of Clearwater, in the years since Daniel Hayes's conviction, have grappled with these questions in small groups at the diner, in quiet conversations after church, in the private moments when they reconsider everything they thought they knew about the man who repaired their cars and lived among them for 7 years after burying 3 people beneath concrete. They had searched fields for Jennifer and her children while Daniel stood beside them, accepting their sympathy, maintaining his lies. They had brought him casseroles and prayers while he slept above the very floor he had poured to hide his crimes. How do you reconcile such deception? How do you trust again after learning how thoroughly you were deceived? The answer, perhaps, is that you cannot fully. You simply continue, carrying the knowledge that darkness sometimes wears familiar faces, that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs, that sometimes the person most committed to maintaining a lie is the one standing closest to you. And you remember. You tell the stories. You refuse to let the victims fade into mere statistics or cautionary tales. Jennifer Marie Hayes was 28 years old when she died, a woman who loved gardening and homeschooling her daughter and keeping a tidy house on a Kansas farm. Emma Hayes was 4, learning her letters and playing with dolls. Jacob Hayes was 18 months old, just beginning to form words and take steady steps. They lived, they mattered, and they deserved better than the fate delivered by someone who should have protected them. Justice, when it finally arrived 7 years late, could not restore what was lost. It could only acknowledge the loss, name it, and ensure that the person responsible would spend the remainder of his days paying for it. That is all justice can ever do in such cases. It is never enough, and it is absolutely necessary. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.